Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Repeat Ron, and today we're going to be doing another Deep Rock Galactic weapon build guide. This is going to be looking at the Cryo Cannon for the Driller, which is their second primary weapon, and a real favorite amongst a lot of Driller players, and I can see why. It is a very fun gun. We're going to be going through each type of modification they have. We're going to be going over 2 or 3 different builds with this. I'm going to be explaining each of them and explaining exactly what each of these modifications do. We will not be looking at overclocks at this time, simply because overclocks change the weapon a lot, and I have not got to use all of them. Plus, with the Cryo Cannon, I've heard that about 2 to 3 of the overclocks are just bugged and don't work the way that they should work. So let's begin, and I'm going to be recommending my usual go-to build for the Cryo Cannon, which is generally a general purpose build. It doesn't really focus on one specific aspect. The Cryo Cannon can be built to some specific jobs, and that's what some of the other builds are going to be. But this first one is just going to be a general purpose build that works pretty well against everything. So for our tier 1, we have larger pressure chamber. This makes it so our drop rate is much lower. This just makes it so when we are shooting the Cryo Cannon out, when we're spraying out the ice, your pressure is going to drop once you release the trigger. That way you don't overheat the gun and it becomes unusable for a little bit. So this is going to keep the pressure still at a good point so that you're still able to spray out the full effect of the ice spray, if that makes sense. So this one can be pretty useful. Our next choice is faster turbine spin up. This just makes it so we have a faster charge up time so that we can get to spraying out our ice quicker, so there isn't as much a delay at the start when we're firing. This drops it down from 0.5 to 0.1, which is really good. I should mention I'm also using the same site that I usually use for these builds, which is karl.gg/build. That'll be linked in the description down below, so you can go off and use this, and it will allow you to see all of your damages, your tank size, DPS, total damage, and you can do some theory crafting depending on what build you want. This way you can get a better understanding of everything that's going on here. So going back to our tier 1 options, our last one is stronger cooling unit. This gives you +1 more cold. Cold is how quickly you can freeze things. So the higher you have of cold, the faster you can freeze things. The lower it is, the longer it's going to take to freeze things, at least consistently. This can vary from different enemy types, as well as any other factors that are going on with your team too, because things like if you're using fire and ice at the same time, but you're not lighting something on fire or freezing something, you're kind of canceling it out. Although if you do the opposite, where you freeze something completely and then light it on fire, you can do the thermal shock ability that does even more damage. It works the other way around too. So if you catch something on fire and then freeze it, it can do a similar effect to the enemy, which is pretty nice. But you do have to kind of keep that in mind if you have like 2 drillers sitting there, one spraying ice, one spraying fire onto the same enemy. Yeah, you'll probably be able to kill it, but it'd be more effective if one person either caught it on fire or froze it, and then the other person attacked it. Just something to keep in mind there. For my first build, I usually go with the cold particle here. This just makes it so I can freeze things faster. That's mostly what I want the Cryo Cannon for. That's one of its big selling points, is just to immobilize enemies. That's going to be what I'm going to try to do mostly with this build, is freeze things and then potentially kill them with either my pickaxe or my drills. That's a very good way if you're running the perk Vampire for Driller to get health back. Driller can probably make use of Vampire the most when doing that. This is also going to, with this build, I would also recommend running the barb drills with the reinforced power drills. That way you get that 5 extra damage to your drills, so you can kill things more effectively once they are frozen. In our tier 2 options, we have larger reserve tank. This just makes it so we get 75 more ammo. Great. More ammo is always nice. We have overclocked injection turbine. This makes it so that we have longer reach with our ice, which is kind of nice too. You could argue that having longer reach with ice is better than having longer reach with something like the flamethrower. Because you do have the chance of just freezing things, and even if you don't, the ice on the ground still can deal damage to enemies, so that's kind of nice. Whereas with something like the flamethrower, it's pretty much you're just extending the range of the damage you can hit things. This, you might be extending the range of its effect, so pretty nice. This makes it so our repressurization delay is non-existent. It's kind of hard to explain this particular modification because you'll really feel it in game as to what it does. But out of the game, it's more the delay in between how quickly you can go from spraying ice, letting go of the trigger, and then being able to spray ice again. That's pretty much what this delay is. I hope that kind of explains it to you. For me, I personally go with either the integrity check to have a less delay so I can spray ice more often, or I go with more ammo because more ammo is just super nice. The increased range is pretty nice too. You could go with that one for this build. I've done it a couple of times and it seems fine to me, but I prefer the extra ammo or the repressurization delay. In tier 3, we have improved pump. This makes it so we gain more pressure. I personally don't micromanage this weapon all that well, so this perk is usually not for me, but it can be useful if you're more acquainted with the weapon and use it more often. I should have probably said this earlier on. I'm not as familiar with the Cryo Cannon as I am with the Flamethrower with Driller, because I simply don't have very many overclocks for the Cryo Cannon, so I do use it. I wanted to try it with other ones, so I'm much more familiar with using the Flamethrower because I have more options there in terms of overclocks. So I will admit that I'm a little bit inexperienced with the Cryo Cannon. Our other option here is increased flow volume. This makes it so we essentially can spray out fuel, spray out fuel faster. This increases your rate of fire, more or less. You get more damage, you get more fuel out quicker. I usually go with this one. Like I said, I'm not that great at micromanaging this weapon, so I usually just go with more simple options. In tier 4, we have hard mixture. This just gives us more damage per particle that hits. Pretty nice. We have super cooling mixture. This gives us another cooling particle so that we can freeze enemies faster. And we also have larger tank reserves, which gives us another 150 tank ammo, which is pretty nice. I generally go with the more ammo on this one, or I go with the more cold particle, depending on what I want. If I want to freeze things more, I'll go with this. If I just want more ammo, I'll go with that, especially if I'm running the repressure delay. That way I can make up for it with more ammo. But, more ammo is always good, in my opinion. Having more ammo just makes it so that you don't have to worry about resupplies as often, and you'll get more ammo from the resupplies when they come, which is nice. And then in tier 5, we have fragile. This makes it so you can essentially freeze and insta-kill enemies. I'll read the whole description. It's a little bit confusing, but just bear with me. When a particle from Cryo Cannon damages a frozen enemy and brings its health below 100 true HP, it has a 1 HP out of 100 probability to deal the remaining HP as kinetic damage. This damage gets affected by the current difficulty scaling from the hazard level and the player count. So at higher difficulties, Fragile will no longer be able to score the killing blow. So what this does is when you freeze enemies, you have a chance of them just dying instantly. At least if their health is low enough. This isn't as viable against large enemies, where they have a large amount of health, especially if you're playing on higher difficulties. Fragile becomes much more situational then. It's great for killing off small enemies. Swarmers, crawlers, the grunts, anything like that. You can still use Fragile on pretty effectively. You can also use it very well. Well, you can use the Cryo Cannon in general pretty well against the Mactera as well, because if you freeze them, they'll fall to the ground and break. Whereas in lower difficulties, you can even use this on things like Praetorians and some of the slashers and stuff. On higher difficulties, that's going to be much more difficult to do. You can still sometimes get it to work, but it's not going to be as consistent. I usually run Fragile just because I find it pretty useful for killing off a lot of small enemies. Your other option here is Cold Radiance, which cools down enemies within 4 meters of you at a rate of 60 cold per second. This stacks with the direct stream of ice path cold surfaces as well. So, in other words, if you are freezing things, you'll freeze them faster, so you can freeze more enemies quicker. This one is much more consistent than Fragile is. Fragile is a kind of a gamble, where you're just hoping that something will break. This one will just allow you to freeze things more effectively, especially if you're much closer to them. So, I would recommend Cold Radiance if you want a more consistent weapon. fragile if you want more of that, roll of the dice to potentially get a kill. This is usually my general purpose-ish build of the Cryo Cannon. Sometimes I'll go like this, and this works out alright for me. Sometimes I'll switch over to Cold Radiance if I want the weapon to be more consistent, and that works out just fine. The other build that I generally use is more of a just freezing the enemy as often as I can build, so that's going with Cold Particle. In Tier 2, I just go with really any of these. They're all pretty decent. Sometimes I'll go with more ammo. I usually go with more flow volume so I can spray out ice faster. Go with the super cooling mixture, that way I can freeze things even quicker. And then Cold Radiance so that I can get even more things frozen. This one I also find pretty useful with running the vampire drills. They work just fine then, just freezing as many enemies as possible and usually drilling through them. Thank you everybody for coming out here and watching this. I really do appreciate it. Next time we're going to be looking at the Thunder Cannon, which is a gun that I'm extremely familiar with, so I'll have plenty of builds for that one. And if you guys are new here, please consider subscribing. That way you get notifications whenever I post any of these videos. I will talk to all of you guys next time. So until then, stay cool and bye!